Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day 2 of RootsTech, 3. I've started to lose track a little bit because you might have guessed I'm from a little bit further away, and I think it's coming up to midnight where I'm from, so I'll stay with you as much as I can. This is going to be a very interesting presentation. You're either going to have a really good time, or this is my last presentation ever at RootsTech. So we're going to see how this goes. A little bit of housekeeping to begin with. You've probably seen this slide over and over as you've gone to many presentations here. All your electronics and audio and video devices, if you could turn them off or keep them quiet. I don't mind if you take photographs. I know this presentation is being recorded, so you may be able to watch the whole thing back again if you like. But just make sure you get my good side if you are taking a photograph. And also, a lot of the things that I talk about will be in the handout, which you can get hold of on the RootsTech app, along with my email address if you have any questions or you need anything else. And also, if we wait till the end for questions, because we've got a lot to fit in, you've sat and listened to me, so I'll sit and listen to you. I'll go around to the front of the stage, and I will listen to every single question and hopefully get you some answers too. Quickly, to introduce myself, I'm the licensing manager for Find My Past. I'm based in Dundee, in Scotland. I've been a family historian for many, many years, very, very small. I was a very strange child when I began my family history journey. I have a master's degree with distinction in genealogical studies. I'm a qualified adult education teacher, and you can find me on Twitter as Dapper Historian, because I do like a good suit. Before we begin, I'm going to give a little bit of a disclaimer. We're amongst friends here, and we're looking at this in a very objective way. But geographical boundaries are very different from ethnic and political boundaries, and the British Isles are no different from other parts of the world. Some people identify by their geographical location. Some people are quite offended by it. So I'll mark out different points where something that you may say might offend someone, and who you may offend, and why not to say it, and when to say it. Just because we don't want to upset people in any kind of wrong context. So I'll make special care to signpost those whenever possible. If we're being analytical, it's all right, but we just have to be aware if we're talking to someone. One of my favorite quotes, saw one from Bill Bryson, a book called Notes from a Small Island. Nothing gives the English more pleasure in a quiet but determined sort of way than to do things oddly. I identify a lot with that quote, but the British Isles are no different all the way through. We're going to start with the very big stuff. What are the British Isles? It's a geographical term. It has no reflection on any kind of countries or anything else. It's the islands that you can see in that picture. Great Britain and Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland is included as well. And there are around about 6,000 or so smaller islands that are scattered around the coast. Most of them are in the coast of Scotland, particularly on the western coast. And some people, as we'll talk later, also include some Channel Islands there as well, which we'll get to, which are closer to France than Britain. This is our first political warning. As I said, this is geographical, not national. The Republic of Ireland is part of the British Isles. If you tell someone who's Irish that they're part of the British Isles, they won't be too happy. They're not British, they're Irish, and it's a very important distinction. This notion of identity of British and Irish is very politically charged. It could cause some offence. So we'll cover the notable exception a little bit later, but just be aware and try and stick to geographical terms. For example, someone being from Ireland is very different from whether they're being British or Irish. Great Britain is the collective term for England, Scotland, Wales, and the islands around there. It doesn't include any part of Ireland, so that's north and the south. And you shouldn't use it interchangeably with the UK, if you've seen that as a country, because we'll get to that shortly. You see that a lot. People think of Britain, and they mean the UK, or the other way around. Be very exact with your descriptions, because so many people aren't. Then at least you're on the right side of history, and then you know when you look back, you're referring to the right element of what you're looking for. Then we look at the United Kingdom. So this is the country that I'm from. This is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So if you see that northern part of Ireland is part of the same country. It's a political union. There are constituent countries as well, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. It's a sovereign state, just like the United States of America or Canada or anywhere else. But the nations inside are also countries in their own right. And from 1801 to 1922, if you're looking for records, the United Kingdom was the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, and that included all of the south of Ireland as well. When we look at Ireland, it's had a rather rough time through history. The border has changed quite a lot to reflect that. Understanding where in Ireland your ancestors are from can really help when you're trying to pick out the right records. Try and get hold of maps, but not just maps from the period, contemporary maps as well, and see perhaps where your ancestors have lived, and that might tell you where we might look for records. We'll cover that a little more later. The corresponding history can really help you. Ireland is currently divided between Northern Ireland, part of the UK, as we mentioned, and the Republic of Ireland. Records can be held in different places. There's the Record Office in Dublin, and then there's also the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, or PRONI, which also hold records. Then, because Ireland was part of United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, there are many Irish records held at the National Archives in London. So there are different things that we can apply when we know where our ancestors are from, and we have a bit of an idea of the history and geography behind it. The Republic of Ireland has a very interesting record policy, which is great for genealogists. They prefer for records to be put online for free, and so there are many free ways to look at your Irish ancestors. Northern Irish, less so. Britain has different policies, but it's a fantastic way to bring records to people. Resolve these questions before you start looking for records. 1922 was when Northern Ireland existed, but political ideas around this identity have existed for many centuries beforehand, and how someone defines themselves in a record can tell you a lot about them and their culture. Pay a lot of attention to the kind of record you're looking at and try and learn about that context to give you more understanding. People before 1922, they're technically Irish, and they're British at the same time. So again, different records will give people different descriptions as we go through, and that gives us a very unique problem when it comes to genealogy. In Ireland, we have something called townlands as well. You might know your Irish ancestors come from a particular townland. This is the smallest unit of administration in the Irish system. They're the building blocks of a parish. There are many of them in a single parish. They're usually around about 325 acres on average, but that varies a lot. There are much smaller, much larger. And to give you an idea of the sort of way this falls in, there are over 60,000 townlands in Ireland, and there are about 2,500 parishes. So there can be quite a few inside one particular parish. The United Kingdom has a number of constituent countries, as we mentioned: Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. They also have their own different histories, identities, and of course, different jurisdictions for finding records. Very, very important. National Archives is the official repository of the United Kingdom. That's based in London. It has records for Scotland, Wales, some from Northern Ireland, some from the Republic of Ireland, from when it was run from London. But then there are also the National Records of Scotland, PRONI, Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, the National Library of Wales, many different places that will also have local records. Places like the British Library as well have records from even further away, which we'll talk about slightly later. Again, the second political warning of the presentation. This is a thing that I've heard many, many times. Saying someone's from England is referring to that single country, the largest one. A lot of people aren't from England, they're from Scotland or Wales, or if you just say they're from Britain, that's fine. But if you tell a Welsh person that they're English, that's not a great thing to do. And the same with Scotland, and the same again with Ireland, especially with Ireland. So just be careful about how you describe where someone's from. And there's quite a growing movement at the moment for national independence in Scotland and in Wales. So even referring to someone as Scottish or British can have its own delicate nuances, and it's become more delicate as we've gone through. But there's no upset, again, in referring to geographical terms. If someone is from Scotland, that's objective and that's fine. So if we keep ourselves in those kind of districts, then we should be fine. Just avoid those terms and keep factual as we go. Those people who are more identifying with unionism more readily will say they're British. Others who might be more sort of nationalist will then wish to be called Scottish or Welsh or anything like that. As we look at the history of the kingdoms of Britain and Ireland, we see we had the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Wales. They were united in 1536, and they became the Kingdom of England and Wales. And Scotland and Ireland as well joined in as we went to the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland. Then the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland from 1801, and from 1922, the borders in the UK have not changed. Ireland has changed slightly. It's had a few different names. It's now the Republic of Ireland, which it has been from 1949. And this is reflected on our flags as well. So you probably all know that the Union flag is a combination of some of our flags. Unfortunately not the Welsh one, which has a fantastic dragon, and I think I would love to see one of those on a flag. England joined with Scotland, 1707, the Act of Union, and that created the Union flag we have there without the red cross. And then when Ireland joined, we added St. Patrick's saltire and we created the Union flag. Now, a brief note, this is the right way up. There is a right way to hold this and to show it. The top left corner should have a white stripe. And the wrong way up is considered to be a little bit of an insult or a distress signal. So when you're looking at the Union flag or you're putting it on your tree or doing anything else, just make sure that in the top corner it's always white, and then you're safe. There are crown dependencies as well, which are part of the British Isles. The Channel Islands, again, some people think they are, some people think they're not, so we're going to include them anyway for now. They're run by the monarch, they're administered, and they're part of the British Isles, but they're not part of the United Kingdom. They have their own governments and their own records stored completely separately if your ancestors are from here, although, again, they're still part of the British Isles. The Channel Islands are much closer to France than England. You see on this picture here, the large landmass to the side is the French coast, so very, very far, and they have a very different identity as a result. They spoke dialects of Norman French for quite a lot of time. They came along when William the Conqueror conquered Britain, England at the time, in 1066, and he was in charge of Normandy. These were his domain, and they've stayed as part of the Crown's domain from that period since. There are two bailiwicks, there's Jersey and Guernsey, but Guernsey also contains the islands of Herne and Alderney, and those extra languages can sometimes mean that records are repeated in different languages, which gives us more chance to find what we're looking for. They have, again, this different identity. There's been a lot of French migration, particularly seasonal workers. They were the only part of the British Isles to be occupied by the Germans in the Second World War, which resulted in a huge amount of records. And their language, as we said, is slightly different. I don't know if anyone here can speak French, but Jerriese, I speak a tiny bit of, because I studied records of Jersey for my master's degree. So bonsoir would be the French for good evening, and Jerriese we'll be looking at bonsoir. And we can see it's a very older version of French that has been preserved for many, many centuries. The Isle of Man is equidistant between England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, and it has, again, its own identity. It's sometimes called Man with two N's. And it's historically been part of the Kingdom of the Isles, which is a Scottish kingdom, very Viking in origin. And it's been part of Scotland and England, and it's moved back and forth for quite a number of times. It became part of the English crown from 1399, and then it became part of Britain in 1765. But the island never became part of the actual kingdom itself, because mostly one person didn't like the idea. There was someone who was in a particular position of power who decided that it was best to stay out of this whole Britain thing. And so when they were almost part of the county of Cumberland, they're still administered separately. They have their own internal self-government. It's the oldest continuous parliament in the world. It's the Tynwald. It's just like the Icelandic Thingvellir and the Norwegian Tingvoll. And it's from the Old Norse word Thingvor, which is, again, a bit of a reflection of the origins of the people of the island. It was the first to give women the vote as well, which is, it shows these places have their own different rich and interesting histories. There are overseas territories. They were previously called dependent territories, crown colonies, depending on when you're looking. This may be what you are reading. They're not part of British Isles at all, but they have quite a close history, a big history of migration. Sometimes there are people who may have served there in occupation or to defend those places. Less autonomy. Most of their decisions are made from London, centrally, and a lot of them have declared their independence over the years. We still have Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, a number of smaller islands around the world. And those are our overseas territories. Many of these have become part of the Commonwealth of Nations, 54 of them, and not all former territories are members, and it's about 20% of the land area of the world reflects the huge span of the British Empire at one time. They've got a lot of historic connections. There are no obligations or responsibilities being part of the Commonwealth, but if someone is part of the Commonwealth, it may give you an idea. There could be records in London as well as in your home countries, and it includes places like Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, New Zealand, as well as many different places in the Caribbean, etc. Let's look at some of these geographical boundaries. In very short, it's a mess. Absolutely. It's going to be a very, very difficult thing to unpick. Boundaries have changed a lot. So as I said, contemporary maps, modern maps, use them all. Take a look at where you are. Your ancestors could have changed counties without ever moving their house. Records can be put in different places depending on these jurisdictions, depending on where things were deposited, what they relate to. And a lot of these names, you may find the district named after a particular town, but that might not mean that the same boundaries apply to a different kind of record in that jurisdiction that's also named after the same town. It gets more and more complicated as we go on. The borders of the UK and Ireland are some of the oldest in the world, apart from, of course, the Northern Irish border, but this doesn't mean they don't change either. In the genealogical space, in the past sort of 500 years, Wales, England, and Scotland have had pretty distinct boundaries, with a few small exceptions we'll cover. And so we can look at these, but when we know someone's in a border region, remember that borders on a map, they look great on a map, but when you go there, you can't see it. You walk along. If the next country is half a mile away, you may well go and buy your food from the market there and come back, and you won't really have a distinct idea of the fact you're changing to another country, especially if it's an open border, which it is in Britain. Hadrian's Wall. I'm sure a lot of people might think that Hadrian's Wall is the border between England and Scotland. It's not. It's entirely within England. It's between 0.6 and 68 miles from the border at different points. And for most of the time this wall's been here, England and Scotland haven't even existed. So it's a very strange thing to use that as the border. But you may find people using this quite informally and saying, north of the wall, or Hadrian's Wall, using this as an idea to say, well, we're talking about Scotland. So it's used as a colloquial referral. And there's another wall as well, the Antonine Wall, which was built 20 years later, and that's the furthest north the Romans ever went. It began, said, in those 20 years, and 8 years later they abandoned it already and went back to Hadrian's Wall. But the lowlands were considered much more fertile and much more valuable than the highlands, which we'll cover again later, and so that was why it was considered so important to have them, and the lowlands still has a very different identity to the highlands. The borders between England and Scotland and England and Wales, they're known as marches. They're often quite lawless. The lords there had extra powers, and they could dispense justice as they see fit. If you're from the English and Scottish border, you may have heard about the Reivers, these bandits that would go and steal sheep and do all kinds of things to survive, because there was really no law at all. It was very sort of a anarchistic kind of place. After Union, they tried to rename these places rather than the border to the Middle Shires to create sort of single nation. But it wasn't until 1620 that they started to remove the army from this area and decided it was considered pacified. There's a small area called the Debatable Lands, which is on the Scottish and English border, which both countries claimed for a long time. And that was only settled in 1552. That's on the western side of the Scottish border. Do take a look at a map, and if your ancestors are in there, you may find them in records from both countries. And there's one other particular example, a small town called Berwick upon Tweed. It was only annexed to England in 1746, and it was changed hands so many times it's hard to keep track. 25,000 men were raised at Berwick to fight at the Battle of Bannockburn. They fought for the English side. Not so many came back. We all know how that went. But over the course of a little more than 400 years, this has become English, Scottish, and many more. The Wales and Berwick Act meant that whenever anyone mentioned England, it also included Berwick. Before that, whenever someone described the country, they'd have to say England, Wales, Scotland, and Berwick upon Tweed, because of the fact this had this very separate space. When we look at topographical dictionaries and gazetteers, sometimes Berwick upon Tweed is included in both England and Scotland. And then we have Berwickshire in the Scottish borders, which doesn't actually have Berwick in it, which is another thing to remember. And there's quite a very separate identity which goes along with being from Berwick. It wasn't included in Northumberland until 1885. And it's very famous for this hesitation of which part of the country and which part of the world it's from. Some believe that they're English, some think they're Scottish, some think they're from Northumberland. It's very, very hard to say. A former mayor said that 25% of the town consider themselves English, 25% Scottish, and 50% Berwick. So that gives you an idea, perhaps, again, which direction your ancestors may have moved if they've moved from one place to another. Traditionally, older people view themselves a little more Scots. There's even a small movement to reunify with Scotland at the moment. So there are quite mixed families as we go through of Anglo-Scottish roots. And there's quite a strange story as well that relates to this. Some people say that Berwick has been at war with Russia for over a century, because in the Crimean War, the declaration went out with England, Wales, Scotland, and Berwick upon Tweed. And when the Treaty of Paris was signed at the end of the Crimean War, they didn't mention Berwick upon Tweed. So they thought technically that would mean that Berwick upon Tweed has been fighting against Russia for over a century. There's a little strange apocryphal story that the mayor of Berwick in the 1960s met a Russian journalist, and they made a little bit of a declaration of peace. And the mayor of Berwick said, "Please tell Russians that your people can sleep safely in their beds from now." It's not actually very true. It's a wonderful story, and I had to include it, but as we said, that act that meant that Berwick was included in every reference, everything went on as normal. There are regions in Britain. Britain's got a number of them. They're more used modern times, but they don't really apply too much to record jurisdictions, and they do perhaps give you a sense of a collective identity. Your ancestors probably, again, didn't really care about the regions, but they will give you an idea of perhaps different things that you're looking at on a cultural level. And there are two particular regions in Scotland that are quite important to look at. Firstly, the Highlands. The Highlands of Scotland had a very separate culture from the Lowlands, and it started to diverge in the Middle Ages. It's a very mountainous and sparsely populated area. From about 1841, and for the next 160 years, the increase in population was exceeded by those leaving. So it had a declining population for all of that point. Many people went to the US, to Australia and New Zealand, and also to other cities in Scotland and England, particularly here, Edinburgh and Glasgow. It's been quite a strange place. You might know of the Highland clearances as well. It's been very hard dealt to over the years. The clans were the system of government there. They had a very different identity. They ruled the roost. Highland culture, after the Jacobites, 1745, was suppressed just to make sure that these rebellious Scots were a little more British. There was a ban on bearing arms, wearing tartan, limitations on the Episcopal Church. But in the 1820s, things started to change, thanks to a man named Walter Scott, an author who was very, very creative. We'll cover that. So first, to illustrate that, can anyone see anything wrong with this picture? If you look slightly below, it's very, very small, but you'll see the surname Colquhoun. So it's the Colquhoun tartan. Problem here is that this is nonsense. There are no family tartans. They were invented in the 1820s. They're all sort of caught up. It's something that was one of the greatest marketing schemes of history. It's a very, very interesting thing. Anyone can wear whatever tartan they like. Tartans used to be created by local weavers, and certain families who lived in a certain area may have used a particular pattern that that weaver made because that weaver was in the local area. There's no connection to a family, but now this new mythology has arrived. It was very useful in the Victorian era because they had such a romantic ideal of the world, and the idea of this wonderful warrior race that lived in the mountains was perfect to them, and the tartan craze happened quite a lot. There's another picture. This is from the movie Braveheart. It's a picture from one of the battles there. You might see all these men wandering around in their kilts with their tartans. So again, there's something very wrong with this. The kilt wasn't invented until probably at the earliest the 1500s, so they all shouldn't be wearing kilts. Tartan, as we know it, again, wasn't thought to have existed until probably about the 1500s. They might be wearing plaid or something like that, so they shouldn't be wearing tartan. And the Scottish flag, the saltire, again, wasn't a thing at the time as well, so it's something we should take with a pinch of salt. The most common colour of clothing that Scottish soldiers would wear in the Middle Ages, if you can have a guess, is yellow. And if you know a little bit about how things are dyed, you might come to the uncomfortable realization of why yellow was the most common color. It's because what's cheap and abundant? Horse urine. This is why everyone wore yellow clothes. There's a cultural difference between North and South as well in England, Wales, and Ireland as well as Scotland, and those identity differences can reflect very different pasts. They're reflected in accent. I have a very strange hybrid accent, but it's considered quite northern. Different words that are used, place names, cultural norms. Try and get this contextual knowledge to understand more about your ancestors, and it might give you an understanding, again, of that county and region. A great example of North-South divide is something that happened over 1,000 years ago. The Danelaw was the areas that were occupied by the Vikings as they settled in England, and it was in the north and east, and those places have a much more Scandinavian-sounding dialect, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Lincolnshire, and more, and even place names. You won't find places that end in how or B, which means village, or thorp, which means hamlet, anywhere outside of the Danelaw for the most part, because these are old Viking words. Yorkshire in particular has a bit of a history with this. They call it God's own country. It's a very beautiful place, but God's own country also refers to Wicklow in Ireland, Surrey, Devon, and many, many other places, so I don't think they have the monopoly. But Yorkshire was very large and very hard to administer. So the Vikings divided the country into 3 different units. And the word comes from the word for a third, the Viking word, Thithjung. which I hope I've said correctly, which was modified slowly for those voices that couldn't say it, to Riding. So we have the East Riding, the North Riding, and the West Riding of Yorkshire that administered different records. And those ridings lasted all the way from the Viking occupation to 1974. And so records can be stored in these ridings, and they can go all the way back through history. But you may find records as well that are covered for the entire county. Inside ridings and things like that, we have wapentakes. It's a wonderful word, isn't it? At the sub-shire level, the Viking unit they administered things with was a vapnetak, which now we call wapentake. These are the local parliaments where all the free men could vote. They would show their weapons to say what they decide, and they still exist today for administrative purposes, and you can still find them on maps if you're looking. And in other parts of the country where the Vikings didn't arrive, a wapentake is known as a 100, if you've seen that as well. It performed pretty much the same function. Counties, I'm sure you are all very, very aware of. There are 39 historic counties, 48 ceremonial counties, or sometimes lieutenancy areas, and Scotland has 35 ceremonial counties and 34 historic counties. You may look at a map and find that you're looking at the wrong kind of county, and you may be looking in two different places. It's very important to understand which kind of county you're looking at, and the boundaries do differ. Again, contemporary maps and old maps at the same time, just to give you an idea of the context and records that you're looking for and understand more about how those ancestors lived. Some people can move without ever leaving their homes. And there's a really good website that I found, which I haven't seen around so much. It's called Wikishire. And again, this is in the handout for a link to get you there quicker. And they have this wonderful map where any place in Britain and Ireland that you can't find and you don't know where it is, you type it in and you can go straight to it. So it will tell you exactly where these places are. I've typed in St. Asaph. I was looking for someone there, and I can see it's in Flintshire. And I can also see it's on the Flintshire-Denbighshire border. It's a really good way of quickly giving me an idea of what I'm going for, and then I go and look for some contemporary maps and understand more about that place. There have been a lot of historic changes, even to the names of counties as well as in boundaries. So look for a few names, and four to look out for. Forfarshire, which is now called Angus, which is where Dundee is. Linlithgowshire, which is West Lothian. Haddingtonshire, which is East Lothian. And sometimes they call Mid-Lothian Edinburghshire, which is slightly rarer, but it can happen as well. So look for both of these names when we're looking for records, because you're not quite sure what someone may have used. And these things did sort of exist in parallel for quite a number of times, quite a number of years. The islands of the UK are slightly unique. The Isle of Wight was separate for many years. Now it's part of Hampshire. The Isle of Arran, which I have many answers from, was part of Buteshire, and then it became part of Argyll and Bute. Then now it's part of North Ayrshire. You see how these things can change quite a lot, and records that I've found to use have been in all three of these different jurisdictions, and they're three different separate archives to look at. The Outer Hebrides, or the Western Isles, they're now together, but they were split for centuries between Inverness-shire and Argyllshire, and again, gives you three different places to look for records. And the Scilly Isles on the southwestern coast are separate and part of Cornwall in a number of different sets. We mentioned the Isle of Man as well, almost becoming part of Cumberland, so there are some records as well from that period too in Cumberland. In the latter half of the 20th century, Britain decided to try and reorganize everything. We went a little crazy for this reorganization. Historic boundaries were totally changed. All these things that have been there for centuries were just messed around a bit, and we created different things. And in many cases, that only lasted for a few decades before people realized what a mess we'd created. Some of this has been changed back, but some urban areas still have separate councils. If you're looking for a large city, you may find Greater Manchester, for example, London, Sheffield, different places. They have their own archives, their own local libraries, and their records are separate from county collections, so you may need to look at both. Perhaps, as I know, Manchester has parts of Lancashire, parts of Cheshire. These records may be stored in the Cheshire archives or Lancashire archives. They may be stored in the Greater Manchester Library. You really have to explore all of these different places. Just to give you an idea, there are many different kinds of council. 26 simple county councils, that's what we like. We look for a county, we know where to look. District councils can be smaller levels of a county. They may be North Staffordshire, for example, or something along those lines. East Kent, West Kent, North Devon. Then we have unitary authorities, metropolitan districts, boroughs of London, so they have their own separate archives, as well as Greater London as well. The City of London, which we'll cover shortly, and the Isles of Scilly again. So 343 different councils to look for. Be very aware of where we might be looking for records. Then London. London expanded over time through history. It's now one of the largest cities in the world. And parts of this could be listed as London, Surrey, Kent, Middlesex, Essex. Even if we get even further, we could be looking at other counties. It's absorbed these towns and spilled in. Search for both of the counties that you know that these towns are in. So perhaps Greenwich, which I think is in Surrey, will be listed both in London as Surrey, and the same with other different parts as well. West Ham is another place that's in London, and it's also in Essex. So look at these two places together. Different websites will classify it in different ways, and also different archives and libraries will hold different materials. The City of London, when we think of that, actually refers to a really small area with very special privileges in the centre of London. It's called the Square Mile, and you can guess how big it is. So it's about 1.12 miles large, the smallest county in Britain. Only about 9,500 people live there, but over 1 million people go to work there. It's really the hub of all of sort of London's businesses. But again, not many people live there, so it's very interesting for records, there aren't so many. There is almost no area of British life that isn't touched with a kind of genius for names. That's another quote from Bill Bryson. We're going to play a little game here. I'm going to try and not embarrass anyone. So I'm going to put something on, and I want you to have a think before we do something, and then we're going to try and do it correctly together. But just remember in your head what you would have said or what you think it may sound like. So the English language has changed a lot over the centuries. Some letter combinations have different sounds. Some things are very, very unique. And we're going to experiment with some of the worst offenders. And some of you, if you're experienced genealogists, might see these and know exactly what's going on. First, have a think. We're going to count to 3, and I'm going to put the real spelling phonetically on the screen, and we're all going to say it together, okay? 1, 2, 3, Leicester. Fantastic. Very, very good. And I hope you all knew that anyway, and you're all fantastic genealogists. Same sort of logic, another one. 1, 2, 3. Worcester, very good, very good. So now we're going to get a little stranger. So this might be slightly harder, and we're going to do again. 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3. Very good, Frome. The next one I've heard, even this week, I've heard it at least 4 times someone mention this in a different way. 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Oh, this is great. Tell everyone that you know how this is pronounced, because I know that it's one of those things that if you do it in front of a Scotsman, they will have a little sort of in the back of their head. Scotland has some very interesting place names. Here's another. 1, 2, 3. I thought that was a little harder, okay. Ecclefechan. It's an interesting, and it gets even weirder. So this is hard. I got this wrong until I visited, and I was told off by members of the local family history society because my ancestors are from here, and I'd been pronouncing it wrong for my whole life. So this is no shame in not knowing what this is, but 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, Kirkcudbright, that's what it is. And to get even stranger, this is a town in Shropshire. I won't say 1, 2, and 3 because no one really knows. I call it Shrewsbury, others will call it Shrewsbury. Whichever side you pick, someone will tell you that you said it wrong and will correct you to the other way. It's an argument that still goes on even today. Any local will have chosen their side. I've tried to come into the middle and call it sort of Shrewsbury, but it hasn't really helped. So there's no shame in getting these things wrong. We all do it. If you don't know, don't worry at all. Use Google. Use YouTube quite a lot. It's quite interesting. If you type the word into YouTube, a lot of the times there are automatic things or people who've recorded themselves saying these words. It really helps. And if you know a local, ask them. Although there are many locals, again, even don't always get things right, but it's a great start. And then, of course, there are so many languages in Britain. We've mentioned Guerriere and Guernsey. There's English, which I'm speaking now, and so are you, of different variants, American English and British English. There's Scots, which is separate. If you all remember at New Year's, you sing Auld Lang Syne. That's in Scots. Some people call it a dialect, others a different language. There's Welsh, there's Gaelic, which is Scots Gaelic. There's Irish, also known as Gaelic. There's Cornish, Manx, Anglo-Romani, Shelta. Those final 2 are used by the traveller community. Cornish became extinct in late 1700s, and they started to revive it in the early 20th century. there are about 557 speakers of Cornish at the moment. So it's one of those that's right on the edge. Manx has 1,800 second language speakers. Both of these, there are no native speakers left. Anglo-Romani said it was from the 1600s, and Shelter spoken mainly by Irish travellers. We're going to look at Welsh, first of all, because understanding the way our ancestors thought and the language they spoke can really help understanding more about them. There's a quote I remember from an author called Franz Kafka, one of my favourites. I love his books. He's quite an old writer. He had this idea. I know you've probably heard of the Tower of Babel, where all these languages were stored in history. He had this idea called the Schacht von Babel, the pit of Babel, where if you hear something in a language it's been translated to, you miss all the magic and the understanding of what was trying to be expressed because you've had it pushed through something like a sausage machine. You are hearing something very, very different from what was intended. And I agree with that quite a lot. If there's nothing more exciting than hearing something in the language that your ancestors may have spoken, in the way they would have said it. So I'm not going to get you to say any of these. I'm going to try my best here. I don't know if anyone here does speak Welsh. Cartref yw cartref trotte de bor, which again gives you, as I said, an idea of Welsh personality and Welsh culture. Home is home, no matter how poor it is. These wonderful proverbs can tell us about our ancestors. Another one, Cynta cwrdd dau dyn na dau funud. Again, another idea of this Welsh love of nature, of their ancestors and of their past. Sooner will two men meet than two mountains. And one of my favourite Welsh proverbs as well is Bwrw hen ragath a ffin, which means it's raining old wives and walking sticks. I love that one. If you're doing Welsh research, you may have noticed a very strange place. Again, I won't ask you to pronounce it. I'm going to give it a go. This is a very strange place. Oh, thank you. That's been about 6 hours of practice in a hotel room, so it's not as effortless as you might think. It's probably also not quite right. The place was actually called Llanfair Gwyngyl in history, and it was extended again by some entrepreneurial Victorians who wanted to have the longest place name that they could find. It was in 1869, a bit of a publicity stunt. It translates to St. Mary's Church in the hollow of the White Hazel, near to the fierce whirlpool of St. Tysilio of the Red Cave. It's got the longest name of any railway station in Britain, and it's a village of about a couple of thousand people, but it has 200,000 visitors a year just to see this name and to have their photo taken, so they kind of succeeded. So that's quite good going. Welsh has been in steady decline since the 1500s. It became a minority language in 1911, 43.5% of the population speaking it. But in the 21st century, that has declined. That has been reversed. There are now 1.1 million Welsh speakers. That's 30% of the population of Wales. The reverse has stopped, and now we're seeing growth. It's taught in schools. You can now read any government document in Welsh or English, and things are very, very different. Then, of course, there's Scots Gaelic. Thi criach yn tŵl, ach marif gael is cool, which again tells you more about those in Scotland, because that translates to one of my favourite, most beautiful proverbs: the end of the world will come, but love and music will endure. This magical Scottish quality of storytelling and romance and things that I think is part of being quintessentially Scottish, again reflects in some of their favourite proverbs and the way they spoke. Scots Gaelic was traditionally the language of the Highlands and the Islands of Scotland. If you're looking at this map here, the pale areas are the places that spoke Gaelic, and the dark areas had very little people who spoke it. The British government tried to eradicate that Scottish identity, as we mentioned, to integrate this rebellious north and to mean it could be better administered. So there was a drop from 22.9 people in the country that could speak Gaelic in 1755 to as little as 1.1% today. And there are now no people who only speak Gaelic. Everyone speaks Gaelic and English. And a lot of dialects have completely disappeared. Although there are no monolinguals, some parts of Scotland have a lot more of a connection. The Outer Hebrides, we see on this map, the very dark green area, over 50% of there speak Gaelic, and a lot of people choose to do so as their first language. It's a picture that really sort of helps us to understand a bit more about the language. And in Ireland, there's been similar problems with Anglicisation. If we notice here, the green reflects those people who speak Irish. In 1800, fairly widespread. 1850, it starts to drop. 1900, and in 2000, we have only a few little bastions. It started to be associated with the poor. English had a little bit of status as a language of power, and so people wanted to speak English. And so poor Western Irish farmers were the people that spoke Irish, and those were mainly people who left during things like the Great Famine in the 1840s. It was quite discriminated against, and it started to disappear. But there is a bit of a ray of hope. If you've ever heard of an app that you can download on your phone, or you can use it on the internet, it's quite fun. It's called Duolingo. There's this little green owl that tells you every day you should be learning, and sort of browbeats you into learning this language. I'm trying my hardest to learn Gaelic, but there are 919,000 people at the moment on this app learning Irish. There are 394,000 people learning Welsh. They're all over the world, and 213,000 are learning Scots Gaelic, and that language only launched maybe a month or two ago. So it does mean that many more people are connecting to their ancestors and trying to get into that sort of frame of mind. There are different record boundaries as well that we look at, and I did mention get a map. There are printed maps, which are useful, but there are lots of online resources that give us extra things we can do and give us this extra helping hand with technology. Place names can evolve, and they change over time. There might even be plenty of locations with the same name. Every single map that you have can be useful. Topographical maps might look slightly strange, but you might find that when you're looking for the church your ancestors went to, as the crow flies, there may be a church a mile away, but there might be a mountain in between, and there might be a church that's 3 miles away, but it's a nice, easy walk. So, of course, our ancestors, they don't really look at distance. They look at how easy or how quick it's going to take them to get somewhere, as we do now, and they may have their records in this other church. So look at every map, and it might give you more ideas. Parish maps, enclosures, diocesan maps, we'll cover those later, civil districts, they all have a story to tell. It's all unique. Scale maps don't exist until really after 1791, when the Ordnance Survey came in and started to produce them in number. So you might have to be a little more liberal as you move back in time to understand these maps, and we'll see an example slightly later on, but they're really, really useful resources, especially if you're not from the area and you don't have that local knowledge. Firstly, there are General Register Office districts. These are for civil registers, birth, marriage, and death that start in 1837. They're stored in districts, and the districts can be 10 or 20 miles radius, sometimes more, sometimes less. And they're named after a large town in the district. Often it's the largest town. Sometimes that largest town has changed over history, and it's just a town. And so their boundaries can also change as populations change. Don't discount, when you're looking at these indexes, records from slightly further away. They may be the record that you're looking for. Your ancestor might be buried or born in the place that you're thinking of, but they're in the town district that is slightly wider that does cover that place as well. When we think of parishes, there are two different kinds of parish, and again, they're slightly different, and they may have different boundaries. There are civil parishes, and they are the smallest unit of government in Britain. They're responsible for all the small things, like making sure the bus stop runs and the flowers are arranged in a neat way. The minor details that are no less important and very, very useful for local pride and for smooth running of government. But they may create their own records, and those boundaries are different from ecclesiastical ones. There are no civil parishes in London. They were all abolished in 1965, but before there were. So again, things to look for. And civil parishes now only cover around about 35% of the population of England. Ecclesiastical parishes, however, they're all over the place. They're run by a church. They're focused on a certain church. They vary from faith to faith. The Catholic parish of Lincoln may be slightly different to the Church of England parish of Lincoln. It may have different boundaries. So you need to explore them separately. There's a wonderful book called Philemore's Atlas, which gives you some of these boundaries and shows them on a map. And it also gives you the earliest year that the established church records survive, which can help to give you some ideas about when we can look for records. If we can't find things in a parish, we can look at the diocese. So the diocese is administered by a bishop, and it's a collection of parishes. Often they're county-wide, and they create something called bishop's transcripts, which are a fantastic genealogical resource. Around about Easter every year, there was a rule that these copies of registers had to be sent to the bishop, so he had a second copy of everything going on in a parish. If your local parish records no longer survive, or if you can't read a particular parish entry, that's okay. There's a second copy. Look for bishop's transcripts for a county, and you might then find those records. In some counties, bishop's transcripts have been digitized and they're online. The original parish records haven't. There are other ways that we can use these to our advantage if we know our diocese. Then there are archdioceses as well. They're overseen by an archbishop, and there are two in England, York and Canterbury. There are lots of records overseen by the church, wills and probate up until 1858, for example. And so you can find these records being administered in these two places, York and Canterbury. If we look at the map, they split the country in two, pretty much, despite your ancestors never having set foot anywhere near these two cities, these two locations. Wills, especially, as I said, they're the particular ones to look out for. And then parishes often contain smaller villages and hamlets. So when you look at where someone's from, they may not be from this particular town. They may be from a small village slightly outside, and you might need to look at a few records to be certain. And so some were split, some merged as different populations changed over the years. Trying to look at as many maps as we can throughout this period of research, and then we'll know where we're looking. There are things called poor law unions. So before 1834, everything to do with poor law was the responsibility of the parish. After this, all the way until 1930, these unions were responsible for administering the poor of a group of parishes together, and that's called a union. In Scotland, parishes could do the same. They could combine and they'd make poor law administration together, and they would be called combinations. So we have combination poorhouses. If you're doing Scottish research, you might understand. So think about which union your ancestors might have been covered by, and it might be named after an area quite some distance away. A really good resource for finding this, a website called Family Search Maps. Again, there's a link in the handout, but it's familysearch.org/map with 2 Ps. And this gives you a lot of different districts. It will show you, as we see, civil registration districts we just mentioned, overlaid with parishes. It will show us parishes. It will show us dioceses. It will show us poor law unions, and this can really, really help us when we know exactly straight away in the town our ancestors are where we're looking for records. Something called Genuki is also very good, genuki.org.uk. Type in the name of the parish you're looking for, and then it will give you a description of that parish and a little bit of an idea of different kinds of records that exist for that location and where you might find things if they're in a different jurisdiction or if jurisdictions have changed over time. So I often find myself going back to that to learn more about the local area that my ancestors are from. Sometimes I find the name of a place that I just can't find anywhere. I've tried on maps, I'll type it into Genuki and I'll search, and it might tell me then that it's part of a different parish, so I use it for that quite often. It tells us here, we see St. Asaph again, it has 13 townships in it. And so these 13 smaller places are all part of this one parish, and without this, it would be much harder for me to find that information. It gives me a list of the cemeteries that are available in the parish, and it tells me all the different places of worship in the parish. So there are 2 Anglican churches, there are 2 Baptist chapels, there's a mortuary chapel, there are 3 Methodist chapels, a Catholic chapel, and another one, a church house. This, again, gives me ideas. If I can't find my ancestors in the records of an established church, I could look there too. And then I think everyone always needs a holiday, and Google Maps is my favorite way to have a very, very cheap one. Google Maps is a great place. You can type in all of the streets that you find in censuses and all these different towns. We can take a look at maps, we can look at satellite views, but you may have used this, you may not. You see that little orange man that's always in the bottom corner? You can pick him up, and you click and hold your mouse. You can drag it to anywhere, and then you can walk down the streets of all these different places. So often, I find out my ancestors from somewhere very far away from where I am. I drop down that little man, and I go and look at the houses that they lived in. And that's fantastic. And this is not something that's just related to Britain. There's a place that I've been studying on and off in my spare time for quite some years, and I'm a little bit fascinated by it. It's the Faroe Islands. It's in between Scotland, Iceland, and Norway. And there's a little village that I've been trying to kind of recreate genealogically for some time. It's a place called Gusthalethur. Here, I drop my little man, and I can look at all the houses and try and place them on my own little genealogical study. And I can walk all around, and I can see this majestic beauty without having to pay for quite an expensive flight or hotels, and I can carry on looking at all these things. So this works worldwide. It's a really useful resource. There's another place called Britain from Above. These are aerial photographs. So as you can imagine, they start in about the 1920s when air flight became a little easier and a little less dangerous. And these photographs cover pretty much all of Britain. We can take a look at these towns our ancestors may be from and see them in a whole new light. There's a map. We can look at this. We see on the top left corner. And when we can sort of select different flags and look at particular areas of a town, or we can just type in where we're looking for. We can find a place name. So I've decided to look for Plymouth, and I've found here an exact place that maybe my ancestors lived. From above, I can see the streets they walked down, the places they lived. This resource here, the 1939 map search, is something you'll only find on the British version of Find My Past. So you have to go to findmypast.co.uk/maps. You can type in a town, a street, like you can do from a 1911 census or 1851 census, anything you can find, and it will bring you to a map centered around that area. We can then select a street. So I'll select here Lansdowne Road, and I can see all the households at that point in history. I can look at the Attenborough household, number 2, and see this household, the transcription. I can then look at the record itself. But what's mostly exciting is when I scroll a little bit further down, I can see where they lived. This, I decided, as RootsTech London has been re-announced, to go and have a look at the area where RootsTech London takes place. Right now, if you look at that, there's a big area called Excel, and that's a giant hall, just like the Salt Palace. As you can imagine, there weren't many large international conferences in the Victorian era, so this has changed considerably, and the character of this area has changed in quite some detail. There's a little button down at the bottom left. We can select that, and we can shift through these different layers, and we can see what this place looked like over history with these overlays. Here is the same area in 1939. I can see that there is no no conference hall, but there are docks. Docks that were being used for construction, used for shipping, very, very different character of an area. And then I can look even further back. This is from 1888. I can see, again, a very different character of the area, and I can see how things have changed. There are a lot more white spaces here. This is inner London, but now it still has bits of field and bits of screen space, which now are very hard to come by. A great website, NLS Maps, the National Library of Scotland, have produced a huge collection of maps, and they don't just cover Scotland. They cover all of Britain, Ireland, and the British Isles. You can find things by place, you can find them by time, you can browse through. Here again, the same location. This is from 1862 to 1873. Then again, 1893. I can start to place these things together in a bit of a row, and I can then see maybe my ancestors have suddenly moved to a different place. Is that because the street no longer exists? Is the street renamed when I'm looking for something? Perhaps they haven't moved at all. Perhaps things have changed. When I look at this map, I can tell a bit more. I can move forward to 1938. We see now there are a lot of buildings there, very closely packed buildings. Might give me an idea of the character of the area, and I know that might be now maybe perhaps more lower or working class, more of a slum. Then when we look at old maps, we have to use a little bit of our own intelligence. I'm going to look at a small part of Cornwall. So this really huge river estuary we can see here, and the town of Bodmin, which is there. And if you know anything about Cornwall, you know it's now called Bodmin. And I'm going to compare that to a modern map, and we'll put them side by side. So you might not be able to see, but Bodmin is right in the bottom right corner of that map, and this estuary isn't there. Also, some of these locations that we're looking at, like Mabin, is just listed. It's now St Mabin. It's again, not quite geographically accurate either. So if you see an old map, be prepared to use a little bit of interpretation when we're trying to work out where things are on a real map, and perhaps when we look at parish and county boundaries. To learn more about areas, we can use gazetteers. So gazetteers can reveal so much more about our local area. They really tell us everything that's going around. They give us details of location, civil districts, any churches, again, established, non-conformist, information about the population, information about villages and hamlets that are still in that parish, just like Januki, which is like an online gazetteer, different industries and occupation, and lots of geographical information that can really help us maybe hone in on different maps and locations. There are lots of them online. A good website, archive.org, is available, has lots of them available for free to browse through. Try multiple sources and try multiple years. Even after your ancestors leave an area, go back and look for the gazetteers slightly afterwards. Perhaps you'll find out that the industry they're working in has moved away, and maybe that's why they've left. Maybe it will tell you that suddenly, as in, say, Cornwall, lots of mines closed and then people left. You might find that this may be the reason. It might give you some more ideas. Vision of Britain is another online gazetteer, visionofbritain.org.uk. It gives you maps, a little bit of detail, but then it also gives you some of these descriptions, just like a gazetteer. So we see here Canning Town, a chapelry in West Ham Parish, adjacent to the Victoria Docks and North Woolwich Railway, 5.5 miles east of London Bridge, constituted in 1866, and has a post office under London East. And so we know now that we won't find records for Canning Town before 1866. We'll have to know what that was originally called. Then we can move on to paper. I've gone back and found one of the gazetteers. This is from 1895. Canning Town, a populous district and ward in the municipal and county borough of West Ham, Essex. So again, we now know we're looking for West Ham as well. It's included in the area under the control of the Metropolitan Police. So when we're looking at police records, we now know we're looking at Greater London Police records. And the GER has 3 stations: Canning Town, Barking Road, Custom House, Lilliput Road, and Tidal Basin. We see it's in the Eastern Metropolitan Postal District. Victoria Dock Road is in this district, a very important road that also could be listed with records. Has a goods department, the Victoria and Albert Dock, as have the GNR, the NWR, the MR. The docks at Canning Town are of immense extent and capacity. Might give us an idea about where our ancestors worked. The Victoria London Docks, excavated out of Plaistow Marsh and opened in 1855, cover an area of 200 acres with an entrance lock 80 feet wide, etc. And we learn a lot about this shipbuilding industry. We see the industries of the district comprise chemical manufactories, creosote works, iron shipbuilding yards. These, again, might correspond to what our ancestors may do for a living. We might then be able to find occupational records. The district includes the ecclesiastical parishes of Holy Trinity, St. Luke's, and St. Gabriel's. This is where we may find some churches, and we may find some baptisms, some marriages, some burials, but they're all in the diocese of St. Albans. So again, we can go for those bishops' transcripts. Holy Trinity Parish was formed in 1868 from the parishes of West Ham and Plaistow. We now know the records might change, and then we learn a little more about the value of this and the land and how much that's worth, and we have a bit of a description even of what the church looks like. So a really, really huge resource when we look at these gazetteers to place where we're looking for family history records. So we've got about to the end of this. We've done 55 minutes of running through every single thing that I can think of, and I know it's got a lot to take in, and I do hope that that has placed some of the things that you're looking for when you're looking for your British and Irish ancestors. I did say that I'm going to hang around for questions rather than having questions here, but do remember to give feedback if you had a good time, or even if you have a bad time. Please, not so much swearing, but session RT8018, Geography of the British Isles, a crash course. Go in there, tap the clipboard icon and rate the presentation, but most importantly, when you go there, download that handout and enjoy some of the links that can help you. And it's also, again, got my email address. If you don't want to hang around, everyone should be entitled to ask a question. I won't leave until everyone's had their questions answered. But if you don't want to wait or you have something to do, send me an email and I'll definitely get round to it, and I'll make sure that you get that question as well. So I'm going to leave my contact details on here. You can tweet to me as well, send me a message there, send me that email, and then I'm going to say thank you, and then I shall be here to answer questions just down there. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.